Welcome to Cognitive Dose. We are here, as always, curing blind spots, cultivating intellect, and shattering cognitive bias.
Right, and today we are definitely shattering some very popular biases.
Exactly. So, imagine looking at a glass of vintage wine, right, and forcing yourself to see literally nothing but fermented grape juice. Or, imagine looking at your own body and insisting that it is merely, quote, rotting meat in a bag.
Which is a genuinely bleak way to look at the world.
It is. And imagine witnessing a fire consume your home and demanding of yourself that you feel absolutely no sense of loss. Now, this isn't the diary of a psychiatric patient in the grip of deep dissociation. This is the celebrated, revered wisdom of Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah, today we are turning our analytical lens onto a text that has arguably become the most influential secular scripture of the modern age. We are talking about Marcus Aurelius's Meditations.
Specifically relying on the acclaimed Gregory Hayes translation for our analysis today.
Right. And we really want to look closely at the philosophical architecture of the text to understand exactly why a private diary written by a Roman autocrat nearly 2 millennia ago is currently experiencing such a massive, unquestioned cultural resurgence.
And my role today is to lay out the historical and philosophical foundations of this text as objectively as possible. Because, I want to unpack the actual mechanics of Stoic thought as Marcus applied them, so we have a solid, factual baseline of the theory before we really dive into any debate.
Well, my role is to relentlessly cross-examine those very foundations. Because beneath the aesthetic reverence and, beneath the superficially profound quotes that decorate every corner of modern social media today, there is a distinctly toxic reality lurking within this text.
Well, we'll see about that.
We will, because we are going to put this ancient philosophy on the stand, strip away the romanticism, and expose why the widespread, uncritical adoption of this framework might actually be actively damaging to our psychological and social ecosystems.
Okay. To begin this analysis fairly, though, we first have to understand what meditations actually is, because context always dictates function. This text was never meant for publication. The original Greek title was Eis Halthon, which translates simply to himself.
Right. It was his private journal.
Exactly. Marcus Aurelius was not writing a self-help manifesto for the masses. He was writing a highly personal survival manual for his own mind during an incredibly dark, volatile period of human history. We are talking about the 17s AD here.
A very chaotic time to be alive, yeah.
Beyond chaotic. As emperor, he is dealing with the Antonine Plague, which is actively decimating the Roman population. He is locked in constant brutal warfare against Germanic tribes on the freezing northern frontier. And on top of all that, he is facing the ultimate political and personal betrayal by his top general Avidius Cassius, who has literally declared himself emperor in the East.
So he is under a tremendous amount of stress.
Staggering stress. Marcus is an absolute autocrat carrying the weight of the entire known world on his shoulders.
A crushing burden of his own imperialistic making, certainly. But let's establish how he actually handled it.
Right. So the mechanism he used to carry that burden is late Stoicism. And to understand how it works practically, we can look to the scholar Pierre Hadot. He brilliantly breaks down Marcus's approach into the doctrine of the 3 disciplines, which are perception, action, and will.
Okay, let's break those down.
Let's start with the discipline of perception. The Stoic theory of cognition requires absolute, unyielding objectivity. When we experience an event in the world, our senses give us an initial impression, right? What the Greeks called a fantasia. But instantly, our mind generates a perception appending a value judgment to that raw data.
The classic example being the burning house.
Exactly, the burning house. Your house burns down. The objective physical impression is simply carbon and wood are combusting at a rapid rate. But the subjective perception, the human addition, is this is a terrible tragedy. I have lost everything.
Which is a pretty natural human reaction.
It is, but Marcus demands through his writings that we ruthlessly strip away that emotional value judgment. He constantly reminds himself to view things completely dispassionately, to break them down into their base material components, and to actively refuse the subjective interpretation of harm.
So the foundation is basically a demand for radical emotional detachment from the physical world?
Detachment from the emotional weight of the world, yes, but crucially, not isolation from the world itself. Which brings us to the second pillar, the discipline of action. This discipline governs our relationship with other people, and it is highly engaged.
Right, because they didn't believe in just retreating to a cave.
Exactly. For Marcus, human beings are fundamentally social animals. More importantly, Stoicism dictates that we all share a fragment of the divine logos, which is the rational, organizing intelligence of the universe. And because we share this rational nature, our mandated action must be unselfish cooperation. Marcus writes that we are designed by nature to work together, comparing humanity to the upper and lower rows of teeth.
Very vivid imagery. And then the final discipline is where the fatalism really kicks in.
The discipline of will, which the earlier Stoic Epictetus famously called the art of acquiescence. This governs literally everything outside of our direct control. Since the Stoics believe the universe is orchestrated by that divine logos, it follows that everything that happens is part of a rational master plan.
Even the terrible things?
Especially the terrible things. Therefore, we must willingly and gracefully accept illness, death, poverty, or even the cruelty of malicious people as necessary, predetermined components of nature's design. You don't just tolerate the storm, you embrace it as necessary for the ecosystem.
It is a very tidy, hermetically sealed intellectual loop.
It is deeply, undeniably appealing. I mean, when you read the text, Marcus writes these incredibly melancholy, beautiful passages about cultivating a mind without passions. He describes it as an invulnerable fortress.
Yeah, the fortress metaphor is everywhere now.
And the way I conceptualize the actual utility of Stoicism is by comparing it to a ship's gyroscopic stabilizer. You have this massive vessel navigating a horrific, violent external storm. Plague, war, betrayal, profound personal grief. But the internal mechanism remains perfectly, rigidly level.
Right, it compensates for the waves.
Exactly. It constantly compensates for the external chaos to maintain absolute inner equilibrium. That is the core promise of meditations. And honestly, that is exactly why millions of people, from Silicon Valley CEOs to professional athletes, are turning to it today. They are desperate for that gyroscopic stabilizer for their own chaotic, unpredictable lives.
Okay. I understand the aesthetic appeal of that metaphor. And I will be the first to admit that Marcus's prose is incredibly seductive. But that internal gyroscopic stabilizer is a dangerous illusion.
How so?
It operates by completely decoupling the individual from the reality of their environment. Let's examine this modern appeal you just mentioned. What you celebrate as an invulnerable fortress, I look at it and see a blueprint for systemic passivity.
Systemic passivity?
Yes. What we are witnessing today with this massive cultural resurgence is the rise of what we can call neoliberal Stoicism. It's a philosophical framework that perfectly serves the modern status quo by aggressively privatizing human suffering.
Wait, privatizing suffering? I think you're mischaracterizing the intention there. He is localizing control to the self. He is not privatizing suffering. He's simply stating that your psychological state is the absolute only territory over which you have genuine sovereignty.
Right. But we have to look at how that concept of sovereignty is weaponized in practice. Marcus writes, quote, "Choose not to be harmed and you won't feel harmed." Do you see how that places the entire burden of suffering squarely on the shoulders of the victim?
I mean, it's about empowerment, though.
Is it? Let's take a concrete modern scenario. Imagine a highly toxic corporate workplace where employees are underpaid, overworked, and facing systemic harassment. If those employees adopt this brand of stoicism, perhaps through, a corporate-sponsored mindfulness app, the philosophy tells them that the problem is not their external reality.
It tells them they can only control their reaction to it.
Exactly. It tells them the problem is their own failure to adequately self-regulate their reactions. It demands an internal retreat. It tells people to optimize their own psychological tolerance for oppression rather than engage in the collective friction and outrage required to actually change the oppressive system. It is the ultimate philosophy for corporate optimization. Just, don't demand better conditions. Just build a better internal fortress.
Look, I think you are throwing the baby out with the bathwater here because you are entirely ignoring the discipline of action I just outlined. You are painting Marcus Aurelius as a patron saint of isolationism and corporate apathy, but the text explicitly and repeatedly demands working for the collective good.
In theory, sure.
No, in practice too. He tells himself over and over that what injures the hive injures the bee. He views human society as a single living organism, like a tree. He's not telling people to ignore systemic injustice. He's telling them to engage with society rationally, methodically, rather than being blinded by their own emotional reactivity.
But look at the actual historical reality of Marcus's so-called social action. His conception of the hive is inherently and rigidly hierarchical. He assumes that the trunk of the tree is fundamentally different from the leaves and that they should just stay in their respective places.
Well, he was an emperor.
Exactly. This is a man who takes the institution of human slavery and the brutal subjugation of imperial rule as the unquestioned natural order of the logos. I mean, he actually prides himself in the text on not taking sexual advantage of his slaves. But critically, he doesn't do this because he recognizes it as a horrific violation of their human rights. He does it because indulging in those base desires would degrade his own internal character.
That's a very modern lens to apply, though.
It's the reality of the framework. His philosophy teaches people to gracefully, quietly accept their designated rung on the ladder, rather than to question why the ladder exists, who built it, or to attempt to dismantle it. When he encounters stupid or malicious people, he doesn't analyze the socio-economic conditions that created them. He tells himself to just accept that bad people do bad things, like winter brings the cold. That is not a recipe for systemic reform. It is a recipe for deep, structural compliance.
Okay, we have to maintain some historical proportionality here. We must judge the man within his historical context. The entire global economy in antiquity was built on slavery. Expecting a 2nd century Roman emperor to possess the sociological worldview of a 21st century abolitionist is profoundly anachronistic.
I'm not saying he should have been an abolitionist. I'm analyzing the tool.
Right, and the psychological tools he developed transcend that specific cultural context. Even if his sociology is outdated, the mechanics of his ethical framework still hold incredible utility today.
I dispute that, because the mechanics of his ethical framework rely entirely on outdated physics. You cannot separate the two. You brought up the logos earlier. The source material makes it abundantly clear that early and middle Stoicism didn't view the logos as just some poetic metaphorical vibe.
Right, it was a material universe.
They believed it was literal pneuma, a physical, material substance, a mixture of fire and air that physically permeated every atom and orchestrated a completely deterministic universe. They believed the universe was literally physically steering every single event toward a maximally rational outcome.
Okay, but
if that fundamental physics is entirely false, which it demonstrably is, as we live in a post-Newtonian probabilistic quantum universe, not one driven by divine fire and air, then the sweeping fatalism his ethics demands is completely ungrounded. Why should I practice the art of acquiescence to the universe if the universe has absolutely no rational plan for me?
because you can update the hardware while keeping the software. Yes, obviously the Stoic physics of pneuma is archaic. We know that. But the psychological tool of what modern clinical psychology calls cognitive reappraisal remains incredibly valid and empirically supported.
Cognitive reappraisal is not what he's doing.
It absolutely is. Think of Stoicism like an antique compass. It doesn't understand the geophysical mechanics of the Earth's magnetic core. Its underlying theory of physics is completely wrong, but the needle still points north. It still gets you out of the woods. By intentionally separating the objective event from the subjective emotional judgment, Marcus is essentially practicing early cognitive behavioral therapy. He is actively mitigating unnecessary distress.
And that is exactly where the greatest danger lies. Because what Marcus is doing is absolutely not healthy cognitive reappraisal. If we analyze this using modern neurobiology, we can see that he is actually demanding brutal emotional suppression, which is biologically toxic.
How is it toxic to want to calm your mind?
Because of how the brain actually processes threat. Healthy reappraisal involves acknowledging an emotion, processing its origin, and then consciously reframing it. Marcus does not do that. He mandates eradication.
He mandates objectivity.
Let me break down the mechanism. When you face a severe stressor, say the betrayal of a friend or a threat to your livelihood, your amygdala acts like a biological fire alarm. It floods your body with cortisol and adrenaline. It activates your sympathetic nervous system to make you fight or run. Marcus tells you to use your sheer rational will to just mentally turn off the alarm. He tells himself to, quote, blot out imagination and turn desire to stone. But here is the biological reality. The cortisol is still in your bloodstream. The autonomic arousal has nowhere to go.
But he's deconstructing the object to remove its power over his impulses. When he reduces the emperor's purple robes to sheep wool dyed with shellfish blood, it's an analytical tool to maintain rational control over his ego. It's not repression.
It is pathological dissociation. You cannot just delete a hardwired neurobiological response through sheer analytical will without severe physiological consequence. If you mandate absolute emotional suppression, if you force that internal gyroscopic stabilizer to stay perfectly level while the hull of your ship is literally being ripped apart by a reef, you don't actually process the trauma.
You endure it.
You just trap the chemical fire inside your body. This actively heightens chronic anxiety over time. It literally locks PTSD into the nervous system. The 19th century critic Matthew Arnold noted this long ago. He observed that this philosophy has absolutely no room for human joy. It is entirely defensive. It's a trauma response masquerading as enlightenment. You are treating systemic emotional repression as if it were a cure, when biologically it acts as a toxin that alienates human beings from their own somatic reality.
Okay, now, if you're listening to this and you actually use a Stoic journal every morning to center yourself before work, you might be thinking, wait, this genuinely helps my anxiety. How can it be toxic? And I have to push back on the idea that this framework is entirely joyless or biologically destructive. Marcus repeatedly talks about finding stillness, about cultivating the fluent stillness of the mind. He tells himself to accept the turning of the seasons, to view death like a ripe olive falling from a tree, blessing the branch that let it go. There is a deep, abiding peace in realizing that you are just a tiny, transient part of a vast, interconnected whole. It is a profound antidote to the frantic, ego-driven anxiety of modern life. It shrinks the ego to a manageable size.
It shrinks the ego by inducing artificial helplessness. Which brings me to the absolute core of this philosophy, the cornerstone upon which this entire ancient edifice is built, the dichotomy of control.
The most practical part of the philosophy.
This is the famous idea that we have absolute control over our minds and zero control over external events, so we should strictly only care about our minds. This is lauded today as the ultimate practical wisdom. In reality, it is a catastrophic fallacy of the excluded middle.
How can you call that a fallacy? I mean, it is a fundamental, observable truth of human existence. You control your intentions, your judgments, and your actions. You do not control the weather, you do not control the macroeconomic climate, and you certainly do not control the behavior of other people. Why in the world should you spend your finite emotional energy agonizing over what you cannot dictate?
Because the real world does not operate in a simplistic binary of 100% control versus 0% control. The dichotomy forces a demonstrably false binary that completely ignores the reality of probabilistic influence.
Probabilistic influence?
Yes. Let me give you a very clear analogy. Think of driving a car on an icy road. Stoicism tells you that you either have absolute control over the car or you don't. When you hit a patch of ice, you no longer have total control. Stoicism categorizes that slipping car as an external indifferent.
Because you can't control the ice.
Of a fatal crash from 90% down to 10%. You didn't have total control, but your influence was massive. By forcing adherents to dismiss anything outside their absolute dictatorial control as meaningless, the philosophy traps them in a state of learned helplessness. It strips away the incredibly important, messy middle ground of nuanced statistical influence, which is where almost all meaningful human progress actually happens.
But you can't calculate probabilistic influence if you are blinded by panic. That is the point you are missing. The dichotomy isn't about ignoring the icy road. It's about clearing the emotional static so you can actually do the math on what you can change. The discipline of action says you must perform your duties. A doctor still treats the patient, but the doctor shouldn't have a psychological breakdown if the patient ultimately dies, because the final biological outcome was beyond their complete control. It's about protecting the mind from outcomes you cannot guarantee, not giving up on the action itself.
But the psychological consequence of imposing that rigid binary is almost always apathy. And we have to look at who wrote the text to understand why that apathy is so appealing. This entire framework is a product of extreme elite privilege. Marcus Aurelius was not a disenfranchised worker. He was an absolute autocrat.
He was an autocrat with a very difficult life.
He had unimaginable wealth, the absolute finest medical care available in antiquity, and an empire of slaves to attend to his every physical need. It is incredibly easy to preach internal detachment from external circumstances when your external circumstances are entirely secured by the most powerful military force on earth. It's very easy to say wealth is an external indifferent when you literally own the imperial treasury.
I think that's unfair.
He has the luxury of philosophical fatalism because his material needs are unassailable. To hand that philosophy down today to people who are struggling for basic survival, to tell them that their lack of external resources is meaningless and they should just focus on fortifying their inner fortress is deeply fundamentally cynical.
I think that is an incredibly harsh reading of a man who was objectively suffering. We have to acknowledge the immense burden he was under. He wasn't lounging in a luxurious villa philosophizing. He spent his final years freezing in military camps on the Danube, watching his own children die of illness, watching his closest friends betray him. He used this philosophy to keep himself from becoming a tyrant. In a world where absolute power corrupts absolutely, he used Stoicism to remain a dutiful, remarkably restrained servant of the state. He didn't execute his betrayers. He forgave them. That takes incredible internal discipline.
It takes discipline to maintain an empire, yes. But let's not confuse the maintenance of the status quo with moral virtue. He used this philosophy to psychologically numb himself to the horrors he was overseeing and experiencing, and that is exactly how it is being utilized by millions today. It is a numbing agent. It deliberately severs the vital evolutionary feedback loop between our emotions and our environment.
Emotions aren't always rational, though.
Anger, for example, is not inherently a failure of logic. Anger is often a highly rational, biologically appropriate response to systemic injustice. It is the necessary fuel for systemic change. By demanding that we constantly pathologize our own outrage, by demanding that we look at a burning world and force ourselves into a state of fluent stillness, we are abdicating our fundamental responsibility to shape the future.
Surely, though, there has to be a balance. The unbridled expression of anger and anxiety we see today on social media and in our politics is actively tearing our social fabric apart. The enduring appeal of Marcus Aurelius is that he offers a practical method to engage with a chaotic, terrifying world without being completely emotionally destroyed by it. I mean, even if the physics are outdated, and even if we must apply a more modern, nuanced view of probabilistic influence, the core pursuit, a mind that refuses to be conquered by external chaos, remains a profound human achievement. There's still deeply valuable wisdom to extract here.
Look, I hear the appeal of that wisdom, I really do. But we have to be incredibly careful because extracting valuable wisdom from this text is almost impossible when the foundation is so compromised. You simply cannot separate the resilience from the systemic passivity, the biological suppression, and the artificial helplessness. They are gears in the exact same mechanism. The gyroscopic stabilizer you praised earlier works by literally blinding the ship's captain to the actual conditions of the sea. It is a philosophy of endurance for the sake of endurance, offering no path to actual systemic improvement or genuine emotional processing. Take these harsh truths, dissect the superficial profundity of these ancient texts, and use this knowledge to build your mental immunity against frameworks that ask you to numb yourself to the world.
Remember to subscribe to Cognitive Dose.